Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another U.S. history lecture. Today we are looking at the empire building of the United States of America from the 1800s through, let's go with 1910-ish. Let's go with that. Laconically put, or to put it shortly, from isolation to empire, how America's ideals of expansion, opportunity, and destiny evolved into global pursuit of power. That's what we're looking at here. Just to go over our learning objectives, we've got kind of a 4-ish number in total. 1, we're going to explain how European imperialism influenced American ambitions. 2, we're going to look at how industrialization and westward expansion fueled U.S. imperial policies. 3rd, we're going to look at America's early isolation policy and how that shifted away from isolationism. And 4, we're going to look at ideas like manifest destiny and see how they connect to overseas empire building. Alrighty, so to be brutally honest, while we have many terms, I want to first talk about empire and imperialism. Now, empire is probably a term you've heard of before. You may have heard of the Roman Empire. You might think about it on a regular basis. There's the empires like the British Empire, which we left after the American Revolution, and France maintains a fairly large imperial presence even to this day. But what an empire is it's a group of territories or other nations under the rule of another nation or a sovereign power. So a bunch of other countries and areas are under control of someone else. The British Empire is probably the easiest to envision. The British Isles are a bunch of small islands off the coast of Europe, but they, at their peak, controlled a sprawling territories like India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, the city of Hong Kong, Canada. That would be a good example of an empire, is these small islands controlled a much larger group of nations and territories beyond its island borders. Imperialism, to get into that one, is the policy of extending a nation's influence through diplomacy, military, and colonization. That's the idea there. And so imperialism and empire building, you can and I will use those terms interchangeably. That's kind of the big term you need to know if you didn't already know it. Now, to go through the rest of the terms, isolationism is the diplomatic foreign policy the United States of America practiced in its earliest days. It's this idea of avoiding foreign conflict, particularly military involvement in other nations. The Monroe Doctrine is a legal diplomatic policy the U.S. enacts in 1823, where we're trying to keep European influence out of the Western Hemisphere. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. The manifest destiny, we're pulling this from a previous unit. This idea that many Americans believed it was their God-given right for the United States of America to extend from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, from sea to shining sea. This idea is going to morph as it reaches its fulfillment. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. The Industrial Revolution is really the entirety of what we're talking about, is the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. So that's where that's coming from. So remember, in the Industrial Revolution, it's the growth of factories, it's the use of mass production, and the greater demand for resources and places to sell factory-made goods. Expansionism is exactly what you think it is. It is a policy of expanding one's nation beyond its current borders. Sometimes this is talking about territory. Sometimes this is about expanding the economy in some cases. The Adams-Onis Treaty, I'm going to apologize. I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. This is an agreement with Spain to give Florida to the United States of America. The reason I have this in here as a technical term, a vocab term, is I have had a number of students ask, well, how do we get Florida? And the answer is we filed some paperwork and got it from the Spanish. The Mexican-American War is a prior conflict. We'll touch on it very briefly, but it is part of the westward expansion story, and it's how the United States acquires the American Southwest and California. Commodore Perry's expedition in 1853. We'll talk more about this in class, but this is an example of American expansionism and moving away from its isolationist policies, or moving in the direction of away from them. Let's keep going. Now, isolationism, or the idea that the United States needs to avoid entangling alliances with foreign nations, is something that dates back to the founding of the United States of America. The United States of America in George Washington's time was not in a position to get involved in the land wars of Europe. And we didn't have the resources to really make a difference in those conflicts. And the worst we could do is lose and then become a part of somebody else's territory. Additionally, many people came to the Americas and came to the United States because they didn't want to deal with the rest of the world. They wanted to pursue their own dreams, ambitions, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And sometimes that entailed, not caring about what's going on the other side of the world. I've got a world in front of me that I have to live and figure out for myself. And so George Washington is going to advise the American public in his farewell address to continue his tradition of stay out of the entangling alliances. Because within Washington's presidency, the British and the French are getting ready to fight each other again, and they're trying to call in favors to get us in. The British as our historic connection through the empire, and the French because they helped us out in the American Revolution, and they wanted to call the favor then. But Washington advised we got to stay out of this. We got to be careful. And quite frankly, we're going to focus more in the United States on expanding westward. The frontier is out there, and there's a lot of frontier out there to pursue, and that's going to occupy the United States from the settling of the Ohio River Valley all the way to the coast of California, and even back into the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains as well. So, America practices westward expansion. We'd study this in other units and other parts of the U.S. history courses. We'll briefly touch on it here and there. However, Europe's a different game. So with Europe, what we have is it's the 1800s. It's the age of empires. A lot of empires that we might be thinking of are from, the age of exploration. There was some empire building, but in the 1800s, in the Industrial Revolution, the empire building takes a new element to it. Britain, France, Spain, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, eventually a country named by the name of Germany. These nations are going to start building large empires to secure more power, to gather more resources, and hold more prestige in the world. As you know, Britain was said to have the empire where the sun never set. The Germans and their imperial ambitions will get us a couple of world wars. The Austrians will also help their imperial expansion. Austro-Hungarians will also get a world war out of it. But the Industrial Revolution makes the empire building of the 1800s a different beast, a different monster, because now we have industrial manufacturing, which means we can mass produce weapons, we can mass produce equipment. There's a greater need for raw materials and exotic goods. There's some things that you just cannot produce, some raw materials you cannot gather in Europe that the industrial machines of Europe need for their manufacturing. Probably a good simple example of this would be rubber. Rubber mainly grows in tropical climates, so you're going to find it does well in South America. You're going to find it does well in places like Southeast Asia. And rubber is used for all kinds of things. You can use it in tires. You can use it in gaskets to protect two pieces of metal contacting with each other. You can use it in rubber tubing. You can insulate it for later on. Electricity is going to be important as an insulator. And so Europeans will go out into the world to secure these things. And what also makes the Industrial Revolution particularly more dangerous is the weaponry is much more destructive, and the Europeans kind of have a leg up since they are industrializing first. So that means that a lot of the industrial weapons that they're going to be fielding in battlefields in Southeast Asia, Asia, Africa, they have the nice weapons, the more deadly weapons, and they take full advantage of that. The Boxer Rebellion would be an example of that, where the Chinese junks, which is a type of ship, a wooden sailing ship, doesn't really have a good chance against a steam-powered ship with cannons with longer range, just to name an example. And that's what's going to happen to much of the world. Almost all of the world at some point is controlled by a European power, and this is the time period where that happens. And the reason for all of this is in Europe, basically since the fall of the Roman Empire, there's almost always a war going on somewhere in Europe. All kinds of different conflicts. It's why a lot of Americans became Americans. There's of the European diaspora. A lot of Europeans didn't want to die in the next European land war, so they moved to the United States, or came to the New World for that reason. And this trend of constant warfare and whatnot is going to continue until about 1945, basically. And so in order to fund these wars, they need more and more resources, and the Industrial Revolution drives the need for more and more resources. Now, there's going to be some Americans watching this empire building, and they're getting a bit nervous. Because when most of the world is under a European flag, one European flag or another, people start wondering, are we next on the list? So, we'll get to that. Now, I've kind of already hinted at this with the Industrial Revolution. The United States is also going to be kind of pushed into imperialism because of the Industrial Revolution. But it has to do with, we need raw materials. Some of these raw materials can't be created, can't be gathered in the United States. Some of these raw materials can't be gathered in Europe, so we need to go to places where we can gather these materials. We make stuff. We need to find people to buy stuff. For example, after the American Civil War, we had a ton of military surplus because, you built up enough weapons to arm an entire country. And so what are we going to do with all this surplus material, surplus goods we have? Well, a lot of random U.S. Civil War weapons will turn up in Japan and be used in some of their conflicts, for example. And so the Industrial Revolution both creates a need for resources and a need to sell materials. We're also going to see a need for naval bases. A lot of ships are going to be coal-powered, steam-powered, and while that's faster than sails, wooden sailing ships, the problem is you can only carry so much coal. And so throughout the world, empires are going to need places to restock and refuel their ships, literally. They need gas stations. That's what makes Hawaii important. There's a harbor in Hawaii. It's called Pearl Harbor. And it's a good deep water port, so you can park the biggest ships in there. At first, you could refuel coal there. Later, when a lot of ships switched to diesel and oil, you can put a refueling depot there, just to name an example. Now, as this age of empires is growing, as the Industrial Revolution is growing, there's going to be a number of people who are going to say, maybe we need to build up a good navy. A lot of our national defense will likely be on the high seas. Like the British Navy is one of the finest navies to have ever sailed. And this is when they're at their peak, is in the 1800s, because the British know that when the fighting starts, their navy is going to be fighting. It's going to be doing a lot of the fighting first. And so the United States also begins wondering about that as well. This naval strategist here is going to push for the development of naval ships. And here's a picture of one of those naval ships. This is the USS Maine. It has a number of design problems with it because the other thing you have to keep in mind is a lot of these technologies are new and they're kind of untested, and there's a lot of research and development to be done. The USS Maine will come up later in this course. There's also some senators involved in this idea as well. there's going to be a number of Americans who are anti-empire building, but there's also a number of Americans who are like, well, if we want to compete, if we want to maintain life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and liberty in America, or we're going to have to get involved in the world to protect ourselves. So you can see there's going to be a debate there that comes up more in the course itself. Now, I know I said America is more isolationist, but we do have imperial ambitions. Let's be honest here. The U.S.'s idea of empire building is different, but similar. Whereas like the British or the French, they're going to Southeast Asia, they're going to Africa to build up empires to get those resources. American imperialism starts off as westward expansion. That whole manifest destiny idea from a nation from sea to shining sea. Well, in order to do that, there was a number of Native American nations that were going to be displaced or fought with, or usually a combination of both, to create this two-ocean empire or two-ocean nation. Many people in the westward expansion period might not have used empire. They would have just referred to it as a nation. So as you're reading historical documents on the United States and imperialism and manifest destiny and westward expansion, you're going to find that there's some kind of unawareness or use of different terms throughout it. But that's what the Mexican-American War was about, was expanding manifest destiny, the taking of California and what becomes the American Southwest from building that off of the Mexican Northwest territories, just to name an example. Here's a handy-dandy chart of some of this westward expansion, imperialism, if you will. Kicks off with the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon is trying to build his own empire, and he needs money, so he sells Louisiana territory to the United States. We've got the treaty that gets us Florida from Spain, if I recall correctly. We have the Monroe Doctrine. We'll talk about that in a minute. We have the annexation of Texas after the Texas Revolution. Texas was settled by American settlers who many of them expected that being part of Mexico when they settled there was a temporary thing. And so the Texans, when they created the Republic of Texas, that was just a transition state in many of their eyes to create a state for the United States. The Mexican-American War is the kind of the fallout and the consequences of the annexation of Texas. The Oregon Treaty here is negotiated with the British, and it's really just kind of organizing how America and Britain are going to interact with each other on the continent of North America. This is the kind of thing that will also lead to kind of plays a role in figuring out, okay, where is Canada, and what does that look like, modern Canada eventually. In 1853, the United States needs to trade with Asia. They want to trade with Asia. But unfortunately, most of Asia, for the people who want to trade anyways, is divided up into different areas controlled by different European powers. And so we go to Japan, which has been practicing isolationism under the Tokugawa shogunate, and we basically, Commodore Perry, commanding a fleet of black ships, black steamships, sails into Japan and says, we're here, you're going to start trading with us, or we're going to, strongly incentivize you to trade. Gunboat diplomacy. Gunboat diplomacy is where if you don't get what you want, you can always apply violence. And the example is with gunboats. This is where you'd use the Navy as kind of a strike force, as a retaliation for when you don't get what you want. Midway and Samoan islands are going to be picked up as well in this later on in this time period. But America kind of says, "Oh, we're isolationist," but we're not as isolationist as we kind of let ourselves on to be. Our imperialism is just relabeled as westward expansion, if you want to be really technical. Here's a picture of some westward expansion. The railroads are a good example of this. Now, part of the reason why the U.S. will shift its mentality on imperialism is because the frontier is done. As Frederick Jackson Turner puts it, the frontier is gone, and with it has closed the first period of American history. Well, it's 1893. If you think about it, 3 years before that, 1890, is the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Black Hills is being settled by white settlers in the late 1880s. And California's been settled. The Oregon Trail's been traveled. People are settling in Colorado and Montana. And there's kind of this sense that the frontier is complete. Manifest destiny has manifested. It's done. Now what? Well, you have people like Frederick Jackson Turner say, okay, well, these Americans, America's founded on this individualism, this adventurous spirit, and they're going to need to find somewhere else to express this sense of adventure. And so he's going to put forward that maybe, we're going to get involved in the world. And between that and the Industrial Revolution, we're going to get more and more active because there's a financial interest in getting involved in the world. But we're not always going to outright call it that. So one of the other things that makes this a bit complicated is we're also going to have some ideological groundings, much like Manifest Destiny. We're going to have some ideological arguments for expansion. It's not purely economics. Many Americans are going to be claiming a civilizing mission to spread democracy, Christianity, modernity, those kind of things. A lot of the language they're going to use is going to sound very similar to what we heard Senator Dawes and others and how they spoke to Native Americans in the Dawes Act. This idea of there's a certain kind of civilized person, and there's certain qualities of that, and they have to be introduced by the Americans, that kind of idea. So we're going to be seeing a lot of, social Darwinism is going to come up a lot. There's going to be a lot of kind of this divine cultural duty language that comes up a lot. It's just kind of a, taming the wilderness, enlightening the unenlightened, that kind of language is what we're going to see here. This political cartoon really illustrates it. It shows Uncle Sam educating all these different groups of people that the U.S. is going to come to acquire, like Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. There's a few others in here as well. But it's kind of this political cartoon is a critique of that kind of, we're here to civilize people story. It's awkward to talk about. It's not a very pleasant topic, to be honest, but it is a part of American history we need to be aware of. So just to kind of summarize what happens with the United States, how do we go from isolationism to interventionism, eye to eye, if you will? Well, we start off with Washington's no foreign entanglements advice from his farewell address. I mean, his farewell address said Americans shouldn't do a lot of things, like start political parties and stuff like that. A lot of American history is doing the opposite of Washington's advice. Anyways, isolationism. From the 1790s until the 1820s, minus a few incidents here or there, like the XYZ affair or the War of 1812, we avoid trying to pick fights or get involved. We're focused on developing the country itself. In the 1820s, 1870s-ish, we're trying to put forward something called the Monroe Doctrine. There are some distractions in there, like the Civil War really puts a kibosh and distracts the American public for quite some time. And then what we're going to be studying in this class, in this unit, is kind of how we get more and more engaged with the world at large. This is going to set us up for the Great War, World War I. Now, as we get more and more involved in empire building, there's going to be a moral paradox that kind of comes up. How can a nation founded on liberty justify ruling over others? If we believe in life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, things like that, how can we run an empire that includes places like the Philippines? How can we micromanage the going-ons of Cuba? These moral questions are going to be a debate. Hopefully we'll have time to look at it in more detail in class. But just because I'm saying, okay, America shifted to imperialism, that doesn't mean everybody was on board with it. Now, I've talked around the Monroe Doctrine. It's time to actually define it, explain to you what it is. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was developed by President James Monroe in 1823, and the goal of it was to keep out European influence. Basically, in the early 1800s, European colonies were falling apart. Mexico is going to gain its independence. Haiti is going to fight for its independence. And as these European colonies are being driven out, the Americans realize, we don't want them coming back. And so the Monroe Doctrine is basically saying, look, at the Americas, North, South, Central America, stay out. No more new colonies. The U.S. will not interfere with European affairs, but we will not tolerate intervention of European powers in the independent nations of the Americas. Now, it's a nice idea on paper anyways. The United States is a young nation. There's a bunch of countries coming up in Latin America that are vulnerable to European incursion or reincursion. And there's concern that Spain, France, Russia might try and bring back their empires in the Western Hemisphere. They're trying in Africa, they're trying in Asia. We'd kind of like to have them go there instead of the Americas. However, in 1823, the United States doesn't really have the resources to enforce it, but Britain's okay with it. The British Empire up north in what is now known as Canada, they also don't want these empires expanding back into the Western Hemisphere. You have to remember that the Spanish Empire funded the Spanish Armada on the gold and silver of the Aztec and Inca mines. The British know that if they come back into the Americas, those resources are now going to be used in the next European land wars. And so the British back us on this. And that's kind of how the Monroe Doctrine runs until the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary is put in by Theodore Roosevelt, the president, and he asserts that the United States of America is actually going to really take the Monroe Doctrine seriously now in 1904, and we will interfere in the affairs of Latin American countries in order to keep European influence out and to serve as kind of the police force for Latin America, Caribbean stuff. We were also interested in protecting our new hole in the ground called the Panama Canal and stuff like that. But what this amounts to is the United States is going to get involved with Latin American, South Central American countries and their affairs. This topic is roughly referred to as the Banana Wars, but what it basically amounts to is the United States is going to invade and intervene diplomatically, militarily, and politically, and economically, definitely economically, in many of the countries on this map. It's kind of crazy to think the United States has run military operations in many of these countries multiple times before the Great War. This is often an overlooked chapter in American history, but we'll be diving into it later in the class. We'll also be the next topic we'll be getting into in class is the Spanish-American War, which is kind of going to kick off a lot of this imperialism stuff in many people's minds. Now, the reason why we're putting in this doctrine, the doctrine's coming in because how debts and politics are handled in the age of empires is very different from today, or at least it's more obvious it's different. If you went into debt like Mexico did, the French might invade you to collect that debt. Mexico celebrates Cinco de Mayo, for example, because that is the time that they drove back a French invasion, and because the French were coming in to collect debts and perhaps add Mexico to its empire. So that's kind of why this military stuff is more aggressive. Now, what the Roosevelt corollary does is it says, okay, France, you owe a country money. We will organize the collection of that debt, not you. And the idea is they can't colonize these territories if it's the American Marine Corps, usually the Marines and the Navy, intervening. But we're going to get involved in a lot of things. We'll talk about that more in class. But this is how America goes from isolationism to empire building. We'll get more to it later on, but I hope this helps, and until later.